Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today we are going to be decorating this epic set of 17 hearts. I know, this is a big one, it's going to be a long video. Just so you know, I do always put the timestamps for every design in the description of the video, so you can skip ahead to one that you're dying to see, or just come along on the whole ride with me. So let's get started. First up, we have what I like to call the bird's nest. I gave all these hearts names just to kind of help differentiate them. But here we go with the bird's nest. So this is just a whole bunch of layered lines in the shape of a heart. I am using here a soft peak piping consistency. That was very intentional. I could have used a medium peak, but I wanted soft because the lines would kind of sink into each other a little better, and something I was afraid of with doing this design was having there be too much space in between the lines and then one small knock against the cookie and you could very easily break the line. So I kind of wanted it to be as solid of a line mass as possible, if that makes sense, which is why I did go with the soft peak. You'll see at the end, I did find that I lost a little bit of definition in the lines, less than I wanted there to be, so I went back in and added a few lines in medium peak on top of the soft peak that I had just piped to kind of get that definition back that I had lost. So just a little tip, but we'll get there when we get there. So I am, again, this is a soft peak, just layering these lines with my tipless bag here. I wanted them to not totally fall into each other in the same exact spot, which is why I was doing that move where I was going both directions. So first I'm just here kind of outlining the shape of the cookie, but here I'm going back and forth on the same side, which means that I am being forced to pipe in two different directions. You may already know as you're decorating that there's definitely a comfort level in certain angles and directions of piping based on whether you're right-handed or left-handed, the position that you like to sit when you're decorating, and definitely going up, the upstroke here was harder for me and it's not as precise, which was perfect in this case because since it's not as precise for me, then I'm not getting that perfect heart every time, which is exactly what I wanted because I wanted there to be like a little bit of messy overlap in these lines, so it really did kind of look more like a bird's nest. And I did try to go as fast as possible for a couple of reasons. It may not look like I'm going fast, but I really felt like I was piping quickly here. C'est la vie. So here we go, trying to pipe a little bit faster. This cookie was definitely a hand cramp city cookie. I mean, come on. I can't remember exactly how long this took me, but it was definitely over, I want to say over 7 minutes, maybe closer to 9. That's a pretty long cookie. I would say like a quick cookie is in the 3-minute range, and that is just active decorating time. That does not include any dry time. Just keep that in mind. Speaking of dry time, something that I like about this design in particular is that it is a one-stop shop kind of deal. It does take kind of a while to get all these lines out because I was using a pretty fine tip. I guess you could cut a bigger tip and then it would take less time. But I do everything once and then it is done, which is very rare in the world of royal icing. Normally, you have at least 2 steps with a design. You do one, let it dry, and then you go on to the next one. And dry time, it could be minutes, it could be hours. So it's very satisfying to do a cookie, finish it, and just finish it. So here I am doing what I mentioned, which is going back through with a medium peak, same size tip, to just do a couple lines on top to give it extra definition. You can kind of see in particular, I think, with the lightest pink there, that it just kind of got a little soupy, and this is a bird's nest, people, so I wanted there to be definition in the lines, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing here. If you watched the time-lapse version of this video, I did actually cut out this part because it's just not necessary. You know, when I do the time lapses, if there's something like this where for the real art of the cookie, I go back and maybe redo a step or something, or further refine something, it's not necessary, in my opinion, for the time lapse. You get the gist by the first 7 minutes I spent on this cookie. You don't need the additional 2 minutes that I'm sitting here being very, very particular about my lines. So just a little fun fact to think about. This next cookie I am calling the Red Wave. Just am. This color. So let me talk about colors for a second for this set. When I do these shape studies, I like to pick a very limited set of colors and a very limited shape situation. So it's the same shape here, same exact cutter, just different sizes. And for the colors, I actually did a true gradation of one color. There are 4 different variations of this color in this set, and they go from this like beautiful soft pink to this very deep red burgundy, which is this color here. And it is all the Master Elite, the brand is the Sugar Art, and the line is Master Elite, and the color is burgundy. I will link that in the description of the video. I'm just so obsessed. I very rarely use a color straight out of the bottle, but this one, it's just perfection. I normally tweak something a little bit because I want it to be a little bit different for whatever reason. It's not quite what I wanted out of the bottle, but this one, perfection. So I should say one thing to note about Master Elites. So they are a highly pigmented powder. This is the only powder that I use. I typically use gel colors, but this powder, you don't need to use a lot. It's really great, especially for really dark colors like this. And just keep in mind that it has to be activated with water. So make sure you put some water in with the powder after you dump it into your icing so that it activates. Otherwise, you're going to get little specks in your icing, which happens to me more often than I care to admit. So let me actually talk about this this cookie at hand, right? So first thing I did was I outlined the cookie in, I don't know, is this medium or soft peak? I actually don't know. I might go, yeah, I don't know. So it doesn't really matter if it's medium or soft peak. And I decided to freehand those waves, but if that's something you're uncomfortable with, you could definitely take an edible marker and trace those out first. But I was just going with the flow here, people. Going with literally the flow. That's why it's the red wave. And what next? So I allow the outline to dry, or at least to crust over, because I really want to make sure they're set before I go piping in the different sections. The technique that I'm using here is called flooding in sections. It's just what it sounds like. I'm flooding alternating sections, allowing those to crust, and then flooding the remaining sections. And the reason that I'm doing alternating sections is because I want there to be definition in between the sections. And that's what gives this beautiful wave look here. And the reason that I chose to do a 2 consistency outline and flood is so that I can get more precision in my waves. If I was really feeling feisty, I suppose that I could have done a 1 consistency here, but friends, In this case, I support the 2 consistency. It makes your life easier to do that outlining first. You're also probably wondering, what's with the squiggle situation that I'm doing here? So the squiggle is done with a soft peak, and it's an attempt to prevent craters. What are craters? So craters naturally happen with royal icing. When it dries, the center of the icing kind of sinks in, being weighed down by the weight of, I would assume, the powdered sugar or the meringue powder as it dries. Now, it's just less pronounced on a full surface of a cookie. There's like the slightest amount of cratering that happens, but the smaller the space, the more pronounced the crater is. So here I am just tempting massive fate here with this crater situation because of these sections that I'm flooding are so small. Now, a crater can be anything from just an indentation to an actual legit hole in the icing. That is the worst. Like, an indentation, okay, you can get over it. But when you have an actual hole in your icing, that is definitely more of a problem. So I try not to do this squiggle situation because I find that it doesn't always work. But in this case, I was pulling out all the stops because I was not going to let this crater. I like to use a soft peak underneath, and I don't want to let it dry, which is why I'm only doing 2 sections at a time so that my peak consistency, my soft peak that I've piped, is still wet. And I don't have an exact reason, but my theory is that if it's still wet, then it kind of can actually become one with the flood icing that you're putting on top, instead of flooding on top of something that's hard. And I've definitely done that before, and I've had the piping consistency actually like kind of almost poke through the flood that I did on top. Oh, disaster. But what else can I say here? I was using a much smaller bag than I normally do, which is why you're seeing a lot more of my hand than you normally do. And I intentionally did that because the smaller the bag, generally the more control you'll have over the application of the icing. And I find that when you're trying to fill a really small space with flood icing, if you have too much flood consistency in your bag, it's just going to come out a lot faster. And I needed to have control, people. I needed control. This next cookie is the offset spatula design. I know, I was super creative with my name. Kidding, of course. So this type of technique is much more common, I think, in the world of buttercream. But here I am using it with royal icing, and this is another one of those one-stop shop designs where you do one step and you are done. And you've already learned with the bird's nest how much of a fan I am of those designs. And I think it's a lot harder to find that kind of design with royal icing. So, super happy about this. Let's see, what can I tell you about this cookie? The consistency that I'm using is a medium peak. I think you can't do anything, in my opinion, softer than a medium peak. So either a medium or a stiff peak here, because a soft peak, you'll just lose the definition of the spatula strokes. I'm using a pretty big tip here, and actually this is the last cookie that I did in the entire set, and the reason for that is that I didn't want to have a separate bag or for the larger tip. I wasn't using such a large tip with my medium peak for anything else in the set, so I left this until the end. I just cut a bigger tip in my bag. Perfection. Very happy. What else can I say here? This is, I think, like a standard small offset spatula, but you can get an even smaller one. So I'm told. I don't have one. I was working with what I had. You may have to experiment with how far or how close to do your dots, depending on how big your spatula is. You can also use a kitchen knife. The last time I did this design, I just used a kitchen knife. You know, not like the sharp ones, but something that has a rounded end will do the job. Another reason to love this design. You don't need fancy stuff to make it happen. I'm doing, let's see, this is a gradation of the three lower colors. I guess you could say three softer colors. And I think that's about all I have to say. It's pretty deceiving. It makes it look like you're going to bite into it and it's this soft icing, but nope. This is royal icing, my friends. It's going to be a hard bite, but isn't that beautiful? Oh, it just makes me so happy. So happy. So next up we have the fan cookie. I know, also super inventive. As I've learned, I could use some help with names, but getting to the point here. So I am doing my own kind of twist spin on using the folded parchment paper, or using parchment paper. So I decided to fold the parchment paper into really small folds, and I kind of wish that I had done them even smaller for the application that I was doing this for, but what I'm doing here is kind of, good enough. I started with, I buy my parchment paper in half sheet sizes, so it just fits automatically on my cookie sheet. And this here is just a quarter of one of those sheets in a rectangle size. I folded it in half first, and then I am doing these fan folds. In another life, I think I wish that I was good at origami. I mean, I'm okay. Not great. But my sister is actually, in another life, in this life, she is excellent at origami. She's pretty baller. It was hard to get these these folds so small. And the reason that you want to get them as small as possible is that the way that I used this technique is that I wanted the icing to actually truly come all the way up into the folds. So some people do this technique and they just kind of let the folds rest on top of the flooded icing, which does give you indentations, but then there are these like flat icing surfaces in between each of the folds, and I wanted it to truly look like the folds of a fan. And the larger the folds are, the higher those folds are, and the more they're just higher peaks, if this all makes sense. So because I tried, this is probably the third one I made maybe, and I made one with larger folds before and I was instantly regretting it. So learn from my mistakes here, people. Learn from my mistakes. What else can I tell you about this parchment paper technique? So let's see, I do it on top of a wet flood. It can even be a flood that's been sitting for maybe 30 seconds to a minute, so it's had like a little bit of time to dry. And that just means that it'll spread out a little bit less. There are my folds. How beautiful is that? I'm doing a one consistency outline and flood here, so my flood is like a little bit on the thicker side. And I like to do one consistency because the icing is bound to kind of spread out a little bit. And, now that I'm thinking about it, I suppose if you did two consistencies with an outline, I just don't know if that outline would really hold it, because you're actually putting pressure on the surface of the icing when you do this technique, and it does make the icing smush out. So you can also see, because of that, I'm not actually flooding to the edge of the cookie. I left a few millimeters on the edge, knowing that I was going to be putting a decent amount of pressure here. It was going to be spreading out that icing. The hardest thing probably in actually using the fan here, as I'm having a mild panic attack about actually placing the parchment paper, is that fan there really wanted to spread out. And I think the next time I do this, I will probably tape the very end of it to encourage it to stay together at the end. Yeah, actually, I don't know why that would help my problem here, but point being. All right, focus here. So I'm using one of my scribe tools here to actually just lightly press through each fold. And what I'm attempting to do here, as you can see, is to get that icing to adhere to each of the folds. And you can kind of see, especially towards the left, that I didn't quite get them to adhere all the way. And you'll see when I peel this off. I let this dry overnight. Some people peel this off sooner than overnight, and I don't have the nerve to do it. So look at that. This is also, I guess you could say, a one-stop shop situation. So next cookie. This is what I call the Ombre wave. So this time I am actually using an edible marker to draw out the waves of this cookie. And I'm doing that because I did want to have a bit more precision, and I'm doing a 1 consistency for these floods instead of the 2 consistency that I did before. And for me, that's because these were much bigger spaces, much bigger waves, and I just personally didn't feel the need to do the 2 consistency outline and flood. I think it's a much more seamless look with 1, and I was going for as seamless of a look as possible. I get this question all the time. I know I already said it, but this is an edible marker. I swear, edible markers exist. I have linked an option in the description of the video. It is a lifesaver in so many different ways. It can do a lot of things. You can trace designs like I'm doing here, but you can also write on top of the surface of dry icing. Typically, if I'm doing that, it'll be a black marker if I'm drawing eyes or something like that. And probably the hardest part about doing this shape here and this design is getting the edges of each color to match up. So I was using that scribe on the darkest color there to encourage the shape and the tip of that left side of the red. And it was pretty key to get a nice start on that color, on the next color down with my flood. Sorry, I'm mesmerized by by my own flooding. Who knew? What else can I say here? You'll see me do this again, but something that is important to keep in mind when you're flooding up next to another surface, whether it be dry or not dry. You have 2 different options to flood up next to another shape. You can either do another outline like I'm doing here. I think that's easier if your hand is maybe not as steady, because the goal here is to get as seamless of a connection as possible. I prefer to do what I'm doing here, which is to actually flood up against the other surface. There's really no going back in terms of the actual line that you're creating, and that's why you need to have a really steady hand in order to get a nice clean line there. And then I just go ahead and I flood the rest of the section. Here I was going for a flat wet on wet look, which is why I'm immediately flooding each section. I did not let them dry. In fact, you want to move as quickly as you can so that you're flooding wet next to wet so that it all dries nice and flat. Whoop! And there I probably said a bad word. knocked the corner of my cookie that had already started to crust. That's why a little bit of icing came off. But have no fear, it was already, it was still wet enough to kind of make that little tip go away. I was giving this a bit of a shake in between each color just to encourage it to sink into each other a little bit better. This was probably the hardest section to get this last little tail to connect fully correctly. See, I tried to use the tip of my bag there, and it wasn't quite a clean finish, so I need to come in there with the scribe there. Et voila! Using my scribe. I try not to use a scribe. I try to only use one when I absolutely have to. So I have let that icing crust over, and now I'm going in and I am placing a soft peak piping consistency on the exact connection of the colors. And what I love about this choice here is that it covers the connection. So if your line in your flooding next to each other was not perfect, was not super straight, clean, whatever, this addition here of these lines on top covers that up. No one needs to know. If your connection was absolutely terrible and it's really messy, then cut the tip of your bag bigger. Create a bigger line so it covers it all up. I'm a big fan of adding something extra to a design that covers up a mistake you made earlier, or a flaw that you don't like, or what have you. Just work smarter, not harder, people. Smarter. Oh, this is just so mesmerizing. You could use a medium peak here. I like a soft peak because it just kind of sinks in a little bit more than a medium peak would. It's pretty hard, I would say, to pipe these curves like I'm doing. Number one key is lifting the bag off the surface of the cookie. I do it anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to sometimes an inch. I would say here I'm definitely in the like 1/2 an inch plus range, especially with the longer lines that I was piping at the top. Can't go quite that far off if you're piping a shorter line. Just keep that in mind, but that's what's going to get you a nice clean line. And there we go. That is the Ombre wave. This next cookie is the shower curtain design, aptly named because you guessed it, it is inspired by my very own shower curtain. People ask me all the time where I get my inspiration from, and sometimes it's from my shower curtain. So here we are. The first thing I'm doing is I'm actually using a ruler to measure out exact distances between these segments, and again using a ruler with an edible marker, yes, an edible marker, to actually mark out all of these different spacings, because I'm not usually this precise with my designs, but I needed to have straight, even segments, which is why I begrudgingly broke out the ruler and the edible marker. One of the best tricks to getting precise designs is to use that edible marker, I promise you. So first up, I am outlining with a piping consistency because I will be doing a 2 consistency outline and flood here. Now, similar to the red wave that I did, I am going to be marking out all of the sections with a piping consistency. And then I will be flooding sections one by one. And I'm doing the outline with the piping consistency to get as precise as possible these sections. What's different than the red wave though is that I will be doing them consecutively because I want them to be flush with one another, kind of like wet on wet, just like I did with the ombre wave, except I'm doing a 2 consistency here because I needed a lot more precision in the sections. Goodness, this is painstakingly slow. What can I say? Let's see. Wow, this is really slow. Sometimes I think I'm piping so fast. Okay, there we go. Picking it up a little. Again, the key to piping straight lines, good clean lines, is to lift your bag off the surface of the cookie. You can see that there. Another question that I get a lot is how to not have like dots at the beginning and the ends of lines. That's really hard. I would focus on getting a straight line first, focus on those beginning and ending dots later. But basically what's happening is that there's too much icing on the tip of your bag when you make contact with the surface of the cookie. So there's truly an art. There's a precision to applying just the right amount of pressure on your bag, making contact with the surface and pulling away quite quickly. It's a pretty fast motion. So if you're applying too much pressure and or not pulling away from the surface fast enough, that's what gets you that dot at the beginning of the line. I'm not always perfect. Certainly, you can kind of see I have a little bit of dot on some of those, but you get better with practice. You get better with practice. So much like I was doing with the red wave, I am doing the little squiggle technique to attempt to prevent craters. I'm actually not entirely sure how necessary that was with this. I just knew that I was flooding small sections. But the difference here is that I am doing like a wet on wet, so I'm not allowing them to actually dry. So the end effect is just really one big flat surface. So I did start to wonder how necessary it was, but I had committed to the technique, so here we are. This took some precision. Something that I don't like about doing the squiggle underneath is that it does make flooding on top of it a little more precarious of a situation, especially if you make the squiggle too big. It makes flooding the outer edges of the surface, the area, a lot harder because it's like this all of a sudden this uneven surface that you're flooding on top of, and it can get a little hairy. So you really have to like kind of actually lift the bag off the surface instead of keeping it super close to the surface, which you might do normally when you flood. So I'm trying not to do the squiggle all the way to the edge if I can manage it. Did not always succeed. And here is what I have talked about before about flooding all the way up against the line. Now, I was really tempting it here because this is supposed to be a straight line. And this is hard, friends. This is hard, but this is how I like to do it. Again, another way to flood section next to section is to do the first line like you would just do an outline instead of the full pressure of a flood like I'm doing here. This cookie was probably, I think, like top 3 for how long it took me, and it was definitely, it was all of these sections. It was doing the squiggles. It just took forever. But I think it was worth it in the end. Something that might be worth noting at this point is that in this set, I actually only did 2 cookies of each design. The main reason probably is that I just didn't have the patience to do more. And I knew that I wanted to do a lot of different designs in this set, and if I want to do 17 designs and I do 5 of each cookie, that's 5 times 17. But if I do 2 of each design, that's only 2 times 17, my friends. The really simple designs that I did with the solid color with the lines, and then the one that says mon cœur in French, those I did more of because they were super simple and fast, and just to kind of balance out the really intricate designs in the set. But so my pattern here was I did 2 cookies. I would do the non-filming one first, just to make sure I knew what I was doing, because just about all of these designs were new to me. And even if I'm doing a technique that I already know how to do, chances are I'm doing it in a different design and it's a different shape, and just trying to figure out how I want to place everything. So I would do the non-filming one first. I would get that solid, and then I would do the filming one second. And, you know, I have done sets in the past where I've only done 1 cookie, and figuring it out and filming it at the same time, whew, that is hard. So 2 feels like quite a bit of a breather, but still a little stressful. I'd say probably my perfect balance, if I'm trying to limit, maybe more like 3, because then I have 2 to kind of get right first and then film them. But I was a woman on a mission with this set, and I already knew I was going to spend a long time decorating this. This was a long day of decorating this cookie. I'm halfway through here. So doing a little jiggle there with my scribe. Something else I get asked, and will probably get asked with this design, is how not to get bleeding, especially with white. I will admit that I rarely ever, I can't remember the last time that I struggled with bleeding. When I say bleeding, it means like one color kind of bleeds into the next. It's not like a clean line like you see here. You can actually see the color bleed into the next one. And especially with white, you'll get other colors next to white bleeding into the white. And it's not something that you see really until it starts to dry, and it's like, it's too late, and it's so sad. So I really don't have this issue, and there I am. See it. I'm picking out my mistake there. Use that scribe. It was wet enough. Can't even tell. Back to the bleeding issue. Bleeding heart. Oh man, I should have called one of these cookies Bleeding Heart. I did not, but here we are. So, why do I not think I get issues with bleeding? I think the number one cause of bleeding, no matter what recipe of royal icing you use, is using too much food coloring in the color. That just screams bleeding, especially when you're doing darker colors. That's another great thing about these Master Elites, these highly pigmented powders, is you don't need to use a lot to get a really saturated color. My other guess as to why I don't, I guess I have 2 other, the point here is I don't really know why I don't have issues with bleeding. One thing I do know is I use a pretty unique royal icing recipe. The ratios are nothing crazy. Powdered sugar, meringue powder. But all of my liquid is lemon juice. That's the difference. I use a pretty standard royal icing recipe for ratios, and then all of my liquid is lemon juice. That is both the liquid and that is the flavoring. Now when I thin my icing, I use water to thin it, so it's not always like a flood is less potent than a thicker icing that has more lemon juice. But I've always wondered if the lemon juice in my icing is a reason why I don't really have bleeding issues. If you know, let me know in the comments. And I would say one other thing, if you're doing details on top of white icing and you struggle with bleeding, I think something that helps is to allow the white icing to completely dry first and then apply the other color on top. I think putting something that's not quite dry, or piping on top of a surface that's not quite dry, tends to get more bleeding, but here I am. I'm doing wet next to wet and I don't have any bleeding. So how many more times can I say bleeding? I'm sure more, but I'll stop now because this is the shower curtain cookie. This is not the bleeding heart cookie. This is the shower curtain. All right, now I've talked my way through flooding that. Whew! Gosh, that took forever. Now, on to the detail part. Again, here I am using a detail that really just saves my perfectionism, because I tried very hard to get those lines straight, but you can see in particular the edges of the third color. Not straight, friends, not straight. But I am piping this line on top of it, and it masks any sense of not straight. It just, makes my heart happy, pun intended. Very soothing. Let's see. I'm using a soft peak here. I would say for most detail work that does not, most detail, like I would prefer to use a soft peak unless I need to use a medium peak. There are times when I definitely need to use a medium peak because whatever detail I'm adding needs to really maintain its structure, and depending on the soft peak of the day, I might not have enough structure to my soft peak to maintain definition, integrity. I like a soft peak because it's just, a little easier on the hand to pipe out, and it's more forgiving on peaks at the beginning and ends of lines or dots if you're piping them. So just something to keep in mind. Something I will do, yep, there we go. So I'm pulling out my scribe before these lines crust to just kind of cut off the edge of the beginning, because you can see now it's a much cleaner edge on that cookie. I don't do it on the end because for me personally, when I finish off a line, I'm much better at kind of making it a clean cut instead of having a kind of a dot at the beginning. You can see the difference here on the lines I've just piped versus the ones that I cleaned off. There's definitely a difference. It's worth the time. You know me, I will not pull out the scribe and do some detail work like that if it is not necessary. Okay, it's not necessary, but it definitely is worth it in my opinion. And again, do it before the lines crust, because if they start to crust, then you're gonna get a really like crumbly, jagged edge, and then that's just gonna kind of defeat the purpose of cleaning it up. So that is the shower curtain cookie. Up next, we have the Ombre crisscross. You'll see what I mean in a second. Oh, this beautiful dark color again. I almost wanted to just make the whole set in this color, but needed some variation. So, 2 consistency, outline, and flood. Why? Great question. Actually, it was super not necessary for this. Could have done a 1 consistency, but I guess I did 2 because it was a pretty large surface. And actually, what am I saying here? So yes, I played around with doing 1 and 2 consistency outline and floods with this set, but I'm lying to you kind of, because I'm actually using the same flood in this entire set. I just sometimes wanted to outline the shape and sometimes I didn't. In this case, I did choose to outline because I wanted the most crisp outline of this heart as I could get. And for me, I knew in order to accomplish that, I needed to do an outline first. Now, you can certainly totally mess up your beautiful outline with a terrible flood in the inside. It is possible. A lot of it lies in that first flood that you do around. That's why usually people are a lot slower in that first flood around, so that you can get the cleanest line possible. Want to talk about what I'm doing right now. So my icing started to separate, which is totally normal for royal icing. The liquid separates from the sugar. It happens, at least in my experience, it happens most easily with darker colors because there's just so much more coloring, I think, in the icing. And what I was doing there was using my scribe to kind of settle it all together, mix it all together a little bit more so you couldn't actually see the separation. It would have dried fine, but you would have been able to see the separation, kind of like what a tree trunk looks like when you cut into it. That's kind of the look, and some people like that look, but that's not what I was going for here. So here we are to the lines, the crisscross. I had a lot of fun with lines in this set. It was completely not intentional, and I think what drew me so much to doing lines with this set was that I was doing this really kind of soft plush heart. It's very rounded as far as hearts go, and I think I liked the juxtaposition of the straight lines against the heart. Totally not intentional. It just happened that way. What am I doing here? First of all, you can see I'm using a swivel here. This is another cookie tool that I try to only use when I really need to. And I knew I needed to with this design because I can only pipe, or not only, but I am most successful piping lines only in one direction, from left to right at a very specific angle. So I knew I was going to be constantly moving this cookie back and forth in order to accomplish the perfect angle. So I needed to put it on a swivel. Now, I left this part in. This part I took out of the time lapse, but I was trying to figure out here with my tools to make sure that I was getting the right angle on my lines. As I mentioned, I did 2 of each design. So the first design I did of this, I got the angle kind of off on the lines, and so the crisscross ended up going up the cookie at kind of an angle, whereas I wanted to try to keep the crisscross at the center of the heart as best as possible. So it kind of went up the center of the heart. Thankfully, with this try, my second try, second and last try, I accomplished what I hoped to accomplish. Very proud of myself. What else can I say here? Oh, these lines. So many lines. I know. Lines give a lot of people tremendous anxiety. My lines are not perfect. There's no such thing as perfect. They're good. I'll give myself that. They're good. A couple of things I do to get straight lines. I've said this a bunch of times. Lifting your bag off the surface of the cookie. It's also really important to brace your arm in a comfortable way, depending on how you sit and, just the size of your arm, the size of your body. But you want to brace, or you want to have contact of your arm somewhere on the table. If you have a really short arm, it might be your elbow. For me, I have a pretty long arm, so I brace my arm on the table just above my elbow, or just below my elbow. I place it on my arm, just below my elbow, closer to my hand. Are we following here? Okay. And Because if you put your arm too far, or if you put your arm too far up, too close to your hand on the table, you lose a tremendous amount of radius of your decorating hand. So you want to make sure that you have a full, I would say, as close to a 180 as you can, that you can pivot your arm while it's resting on the table. And then something that a lot of people do, that if you don't have a very steady hand, I would recommend doing, is to take your other hand, so not your decorating hand, and take your pointer and your middle finger and lightly brace them on your piping hand somehow. Maybe it's on the palm of your hand, maybe it's on the piping bag itself. I personally have just never liked decorating like that, but decorators of all skill levels from beginner to advanced do that kind of decorating technique. So something to consider if you don't have a very steady hand. So that is the Ombre crisscross. Next up, we have the knit. And here I am again. I am drawing lines as guides. I wasn't as concerned with being super precise because these were more guides. I wasn't following these exactly. I just wanted to make sure I was staying at the same angle, and that I was keeping these knit patterns as straight as possible. Don't do what I did at the very beginning of this, where I really drew all the way to the edge. Do yourself a favor. You don't actually need to draw the guidelines all the way to the edge. There you can see right at the beginning of this that I kind of struggled to cover up the end of my line. Oopsie. Here we go. I am doing what I call the knit technique. I don't know if that's what it's really called, but it is a pressure piping technique that gives you this knit effect. What do I mean by pressure piping? It means that I am varying the pressure on my bag as I'm piping. It's hard. I will say it is hard to wrap your brain around. The general idea here is I'm piping these teardrops. So you pipe a dot and you pull away, and as you pull away, you are releasing pressure at the same time. And to get this knit effect, I am kind of doing this V, this V motion, and piping them right next to each other. So to get this effect, you really need to make them tight. And speaking of tight, something else that's really the key to this design here, because most people will do a knit technique on top of a flooded surface, but as you can see here, I chose to do it on top of a naked cookie because I wanted this to be a really tight knit, and my plan was not to be able to see the surface underneath the knit at all. So what's the point in flooding the surface if I'm just going to completely cover it, was my thought process. So but I will say it did make it a little more stressful to pipe the knit because I had to make sure that it was as tight as possible next to each other. So that's what I'm doing here, and I'll talk about piping on the opposite angle at a second, opposite side. So this is my happy place because I'm right-handed. So piping at this angle is definitely easier. Now, if you can look closely, and the left pipe, you can see that I kind of tucked it in to the openings. That was to make sure that I was doing as tight of a knit as possible. And that also kind of helps me keep the size of the knit consistent. And again, so you can see here when I started this knit, I was piping right down a line, but now I'm kind of piping next to a line. But this, again, this just keeps me consistent with the size. Now, this is not my happy place. I am right-handed, and normally the angle of my bag is like a, I don't know, 45-degree angle facing me, but I can't get into the crevice of that icing if my bag is 45 degrees against the icing, if that makes sense. So I'm having to turn my bag kind of more closer to like beyond a 90-degree so that I can get the right angle to pipe, and that is very uncomfortable to pipe beyond a 90-degree. So now if you're left-handed, this would not be your happy place side. This would be your sad place. We all have that though. But I was really determined to alternate the direction of my knit. If I had been okay just knitting all one way, then I could have piped the entire thing from my happy place angle. But sometimes you just gotta suffer in the name of the design. Very sarcastic here. So I'm going to leave you here while I finish piping this knit, and I will be back when I'm done. Oh, one other thing I need to say. This is medium peak. I highly recommend medium peak for knit. Soft, it will kind of melt into each other too much, and a stiff peak, you will kill your hand. It will just not. It will be awful. You'll get a hand cramp after like 2 rows. So medium peak, that's the sweet spot. For real this time. I'm leaving you with the knit, and I'll be back when I'm done. And here we are coming up to the very end of this knit cookie. I know this one was a doozy, that's for sure, but worth it, right? Oh, just so satisfying. Look at that. Look at that. It's work of art. Next up, this is going to be the Prism design. So what have we here? I am outlining and flooding with two consistencies here, but remember that I said I'm actually using the same flood consistency for this entire set. So really, I'm just choosing to outline with my piping consistency and then flooding. And again, same reason I chose to outline first. I just wanted a really crisp outline on this shape. In this set, I did the same heart shape in two different sizes to add a little bit of variety. And I chose to do different designs on different sizes based on the kind of design. Some of them I just knew would thrive on a bigger surface, and some of them I just wanted to do on a smaller surface because maybe it was too labor intensive. Like that knit one, for example, that was on the smaller cookie. I mean, can you imagine doing that on a larger cookie? I definitely would have needed to have cut a bigger tip in the bag than I had, because that would have taken all day on this bigger size. So jiggling this out, because my flood is a bit on the thicker side here. One of my favorite scribes that I was using. I allow that to crust over, and here I am piping lines, and look at that, my line broke. Gasp. No. Lines break. Even for us advanced cookiers, they still break sometimes. So why do lines break? I believe it is due to inconsistent pressure on the bag. Sometimes you might have some sort of a clog or something in the icing, but assuming that your icing is a-okay, it's likely because of inconsistent pressure on the bag. So you really have to be confident piping these lines. Once you start, there ain't no going back. And I find generally when I'm decorating, I feel like I tend to hold my breath, especially when I'm doing something hard, but probably in this very moment right here, I was probably holding my breath, which is not good. Not good. Breathe, friends. Breathe. I guess I just focus so much. But let's talk about this design here. So I was eyeing all of this, obviously freehanding it. I'm a freehander unless I have to do otherwise. Now, if you're a little uncomfortable with the freehand, you could take a scribe and actually mark out the start points of each line on the left side of the heart. Not necessary, but something to do if you're not quite confident in just eyeing the spacing. As I'm doing this, I'm also thinking, if you're left-handed, go the opposite direction, friends. Or if you really want to go from or do the design in this way, then flip the cookie over so you can still be piping from right to left, which is, if you're left-handed, that's going to be your comfort zone. Piping right to left for me is not my happy place. Happy place is left to right because I'm right-handed. Definitely got pretty close with these lines. But I think it looks cool. Got a little bit of overlap at the end, but I liked the ombre effect, and that is the prism. Up next, we have the leopard print. aptly named because we're going to be doing leopard print here. Certainly not my first time doing leopard print, but friends, you can do leopard in any color. It is so versatile, quite easy, I would say, to do. Utilizes my favorite technique of wet on wet. So, what is wet on wet? Great question. Wet on wet is a technique where you're applying wet icing on top of wet icing. And what that does is they sink into each other and they dry flat, and it's this cool kind of illusion, sort of. They almost look painted, but it's not. Absolutely my favorite technique. It is super versatile. You can do so much with it. And that is the essence of the leopard. Probably the hardest thing. Okay, there are a couple hard things about wet on wet, I would say. You have to move pretty quickly, number one. Number two, you don't want to over flood. So you could see there with that pink that I was flooding, I kind of under flooded. I left some holes to ensure that I didn't already have too much icing on the base of the cookie, so that when I then go in and add more icing on top of it, I'm not tempting fate here by likely over flooding it. And that's just something to keep in mind. It depends on the wet on wet design you're doing. If you're only adding just a couple of extra lines or something, then you don't need to be as concerned with under flooding it. I would say the third hardest thing probably with wet on wet is you have to get your consistency kind of just right. Certainly the thinner the flood, generally the easier it is to do. That said, I mean, there is such thing as too thin of a flood, and it could actually create craters if it's too thin. But too thick is also insanely difficult in and of itself, because if it's too thick, then it just gives you no time to work with it. Like by the time you go to do your wet on wet design, the flood has already started to crust, and that will not work because it needs to stay wet. So you have to move quite quickly. What I love about the leopard print design is that it can be messy, and it doesn't need to look perfect. That's kind of the beauty of it. Just these little blobs. I usually like to do lightest on the base, the bigger blobs in a medium color, and a darker color in the little outline bits. Here I am using my scribe to kind of help settle out some of those last things that I piped, because this was tempting fate here with how thick my flood was, my flood consistency. So if you just kind of jiggle the surface of the icing, it can help it settle. And here I am doing a tap to encourage the entire cookie to settle just a bit more. So don't do anything thicker than what I did. Do yourself a favor. But I just love this. Look at that leopard print. Next up, we have the geometric crisscross. Now, this is yet another wet on wet design. And again, I'm doing the outline first with piping consistency. And then I will let this crust for a minute, and then flood the flood next. Why do I like to let the outline crust first? People ask all the time, should I allow the outline to dry? Should I leave it wet? And it can kind of be precarious either way. If you're a little too rough with your outline, if it's dry, then you can actually kind of break off the outline, especially if you're using really thick icing. It dries much faster, and it doesn't really adhere to the surface of the cookie, so that's easy to really crack off. But then if you're leaving your outline wet, then the outline can actually move, which kind of defeats the purpose of the outline. The outline is supposed to really help hold in that icing in a specific shape. So I like to let it crust a little bit. Now, here we go. wet on wet lines. I believe here I actually piped this white icing in a smaller bag because this is my white flood. But as I've said before, you have more control over your bag when there's less icing in it. Now, you don't want to put too little icing. Me personally, I like to have at least, 2 ounces, 2 to 3 ounces is kind of my minimum sweet spot. A lot of people work with just 1 ounce, but I have big hands, so I like, at least 2-3 ounces. I also wanted to be able to cut the tip of this bag smaller than what I was using for actually flooding the surfaces of the other cookies. So sometimes it takes a little more thinking. Oh, but look at this. I just see the lines just overlap and they just become one because you're doing the wet on wet. It all falls into each other. It's just so satisfying. Satisfying to pipe, it's satisfying to watch, satisfying finish. Something else I did differently with this set, which I don't normally do, is I actually used some of the Master Elite, the Sugar Art Master Elite in white, in my white icing. I don't normally color my white icing, but I really wanted my white to pop, and look how much that pops. It was absolutely worth it. This next cookie I am calling the 80s Stripes. I had a lot of people say that this cookie reminded them of a jacket or a sweatshirt they may have had in the 80s, so here we go, the 80s Stripes. Again, we're rocking a piping consistency outline first up, and then you can see that little editing shift there. That means that I did allow that to crust over, and I'm doing kind of a different wet on wet here, where I'm going to be doing pretty significant stripes here, so I didn't want to just flood the entire surface white and then pipe these big stripes over. That would have absolutely over flooded the cookie. So I'm actually flooding the stripes first, and then I'll fill in the rest of the cookie with white. And again, I'm freehanding this, but you could definitely draw these stripes with an edible marker. No one will see. No one will know. No one will know. Your secret is safe with me. It's just so satisfying to watch flooding. Whew. So what I was saying earlier about adding the white coloring to my white icing, since I don't use vanilla, I'm using lemon juice, which is tinted a little bit yellow, of course, but if I whip my icing just as I normally would to mix it all together, I find that it gets to pretty decent white. It's not like a bright white, but it's white enough, and every other set you've seen me do, I have not colored my white icing. But this set, I wanted my white to really pop, which is why I added the white coloring. Which reminds me, a lot of people give the tip to color your white icing if you have bleeding problems. So remember when I was talking about bleeding before? Again, this is the first time I've ever colored my white icing, so clearly it's not something I personally need to do for my recipe and how I work, but if you're having bleeding issues with your white, I'd suggest coloring it. And it's giving me a little bit of a hernia, that my lines aren't totally straight here, but that is the beauty of how I decided to finish this cookie. So once I finished flooding this, fun fact, I was actually going to do the detail lines that I'm about to do in a moment in the middle of these stripes, but when I looked at the lines of my stripes, I was like, I need to cover these up because this is making my perfectionist heart hurt. Give that a little jiggle. And allow this to crust. Ayo. Oh, fixing my little peak there. Are we gonna crust? When do we crust? There we go. So, I decided to actually put the lines at the intersection of the colors. This was a on-the-spot decision, not what I was planning to do, but it made me feel like this design was a much cleaner finish, which I really liked. Oh, just so satisfying. And again, a tip I had before, a couple things. So I am kind of trimming off the ends to get the cleanest starts and finishes on my lines. And if you're doing this technique or you're doing this detail finish also to cover up messy connections of your lines, if you did a really messy job, just cut a bigger tip in your icing bag and more coverage. It'll look intentional. No one will know that that's why your lines are bigger. Only you will know. I love doing things like that. Everyone just thinks that it's a beautiful finish to your cookie, but no, actually there was a purpose to it. Purposeful and beautiful. My fave. And there we go. That is the 80s stripes. And next up, we have the lips design. I was really happy about this one. This is another wet on wet, super different application than anything I've done yet. And first of all, you will see here that I am outlining the cookie, but not to the edge of the cookie. And that is because after I'm done with the design in the center, I'm actually going to do a border on the heart. I don't normally do borders. Actually, when I first started cookies, I did a lot of borders. Really inspired a lot by Sweet Am's, and she's the pressure piped border queen. So this was very much inspired by her. And let's see. So I actually didn't let that outline dry before I went on to flood. Flying by the seat of my pants here, people. Living on the edge. I wasn't too concerned about it because I'm not going to be adding a lot of icing in my design here. So you'll see I'm just starting with these red dots. Now you could think, she's just doing polka dots. No, friends, I'm not just doing polka dots. Oh, look at that scribe. Oh, how exciting. So look at that. They're lips. All right. I'm using a scribe here to pull down the center, just to the center of the dot, not all the way through, and then pulling from the center out to get the sides of the lips. Now you'll see what I'm doing is I'm actually cleaning off my scribe in between each pull. And that's really important for this design because if I don't clean off my scribe, then I will have white icing left on the tip of my scribe, and I will drag wet icing into parts of those lips that I don't want wet icing. So that's really important that you clean it off, using my scribe there to kind of just jiggle down that tip. Now I allowed this to crust over, and I'm doing this pressure piped border. Oh, how satisfying to watch. So what is this? Now, remember when I was doing the knit technique? This is the same stroke in a different application. It's this same, I call it a teardrop stroke, where you pipe a bead. You can see I'm piping a bead, and then I pull away, And as I pull away, I'm releasing pressure on the bag. And I'm overlapping the beginning of my bead with the end of the teardrop. So you get this nice continuous teardrop line. And here I am using my cookie swivel again. And doing this again because this is the kind of technique that I really need to be always piping at the same exact angle to get it right. Especially doing it on a border like this that's really around the edge of the cookie instead of, say, on top of the edge of the cookie. I'm coming at it from an angle other than just the top of the cookie, if that makes sense. So I'm always in favor of moving the cookie to the angle that makes it most convenient for you. I would say there are 2 reasons why I just don't do that all the time. I would say one that I caution everyone against is I do think that the swivel can be kind of an enabler. And it is good to be able to learn to push yourself to maybe pipe at a not super ideal angle. And then just for filming purposes, I don't like to use a swivel a lot when I'm filming because I feel like it can be a little jarring. I mean, in the real time here, it's not jarring, but I do a lot of sped up videos. And that you just get a little more seasick kind of, I think. Constantly turning that swivel around. So this last little detail, I was gonna just do the lips, but I thought it needed a little something extra, and so these are just dots piped with soft peak. And it's soft peak because you can see that the little dots pretty much settle on their own, so I don't have to worry about them having a peak on the end of them, which does not look great. And there we have the lip cookie. Next up we have the chocolate dip strawberry. Now, did an unofficial poll and not a lot of people got that this was supposed to be a chocolate covered strawberry. I know, it's the shape of a heart. Roll with me here, people. This is the white chocolate dipped part. So it's like the shape of a strawberry. It just doesn't have the leaves on the top. So the tip here is dipped in white chocolate. And I decided to do an outline here because I wanted to make sure I got a really satisfying, I suppose, crisp, maybe that's a better word, kind of line at the top there to show my dip. I might have exaggerated that line a little bit. Dips aren't really quite that wavy, but this is a cookie. So you can make your chocolate dip as wavy as you want. Giving that a little jiggle. And then here I am doing the strawberry part, so the top part. One question I got the other day was someone who's followed me a long time and watched my videos for a long time, and she noticed that I do a lot more jiggling now than I used to. So why is that, you're asking? Well, I think what it is that when I first started, I did a lot more true to consistency outline and flood, where I used a pretty thin flood. And when you use a thinner flood, you do not need to do any jiggling to get it to settle. It just settles beautifully on its own. But when you use a thicker flood, it does need some help to settle. And I've been doing a lot more, I think, one consistency outline and flood, which often needs a scribe to help it settle. And just working with a lot more thicker consistencies, because that's really what gets you the poof and the beautiful dimension a lot, is when you're using a thicker flood or maybe a soft peak. But that's a subject for another day. now I'm finishing off this strawberry. So that is the drizzle on the white chocolate. Hopefully you're following me here. And then these are the seeds of the strawberry. The seeds of the strawberry. Some people said they looked like other things, but we're gonna go with strawberry seeds because that was the intention here. My heart-shaped strawberry, I was gonna say strawberry covered chocolate. Where is my brain? My heart-shaped chocolate covered strawberry. You know, it's art. It's art. I think it's cute. I like it. Beautiful colors, of course. And there we go. The next design is what I call the Ombre vertical lines. I know, my names could be better, but I'm just trying to give you a quick, clear sense of what the design type is, so it's easier to find later if you want. I've done this design before. I actually did it on my set of trees that I did last year, and that one I did the lines horizontal, and I did them really tight and in alternating ombre colors. It took me forever. I think the lines took me 10 minutes per cookie. I mean, that is just outrageous, friends. Just outrageous. So I wanted to try something a little different with this one. Visually different, but also, can I make this a little faster? So a couple things I did for visual difference. Obviously the concept here is I do a cutout in the middle of the shape of the cutter. So before, when I did a tree, it was a small tree in the middle, but this one is a heart. And I decided to do the lines vertical instead of horizontal. I spaced them out a bit more, and I still did an ombre effect, but I did it one color chunk at a time. That gives it a bit of a visual difference, but also makes things go a little bit faster. I think, at least that was my thought process. So this definitely was a faster cookie, fewer lines, less piping. I would say the one thing that I regretted as soon as I started filming, but here we are, is that I wish I had turned the cookie so that I could pipe my lines from left to right. Remember, I told you my happy place is from left to right. Vertical lines, not my happy place. But for the sake of the video, I left the cookie vertical like this just so it looked more satisfying. Because who wants to see a heart sideways? I don't know, maybe you don't care, but that was my thought process. So I could tell after I finished piping this that my lines definitely could have been straighter than they were, but here we are. So how did I accomplish what I'm doing right now? I found an image of just lines on the internet, and then on my iPad, just on a notes app, I put the image in there, and then I drew a heart on top of it. And actually, I may have found an image of a heart, so that I could draw it perfectly, because I'm not the best freehand drawer, believe it or not. And I made sure to place the heart at a size of the lines that I liked, of the spacing. And then I used my projector. Love my projector. And I'm projecting that image from my iPad onto the surface of this dry cookie. I could not do something like this, of these repeating lines, without tracing. I mean, I could, but being able to trace the lines is just so much easier than having to freehand them. Believe me. you can see here, actually maybe this is a good angle. You can kind of see a little bit better how far I'm pulling my bag off the surface of the cookie. I think you'll be able to see it better when I think I'm doing a full line. Yeah, here we go. So let's see how far. Ooh, look at that. Oh, and my line broke. So that's maybe 1/4 of an inch-ish. Maybe sometimes approaching 1/2 inch. Lines break. Remember what I said, lines break. And I was only doing 2 cookies. Only doing 2 cookies. So I just had to roll with it. I'm honestly just mesmerized again, staring at myself piping lines. This is also a real test too, to getting that start of your line right, because holy cow, doing a line start to make the shape of this heart, a little stressful, not gonna lie. I will say another thing I wish I had done with this cookie that I did do on the tree was that, like I have done on other cookies in this set, I trimmed off the edge of the line. And I thought, I don't need to do that. That's not really necessary. But I will say when I saw the finished product, I was like, I wish I had trimmed the edges of the lines. It just gives you this beautiful, like, waterfall effect of the line on the edge of the cookie. It's just so much cleaner. So, but that's something that just takes even more time. So I'm doing it on some of these because these were just atrocious. But I did not do it on all of the lines, and I did regret that. So I've got a few more lines here to pipe. I used a soft peak here. Soft peak I think is important for the starts and the finishes of the lines. It makes that a bit easier. And I'll leave you here, and I'll be back when I'm done piping these lines. Coming in for the last stripe on this cookie. Woo! There we go. Oh, see, you can see, especially on the left, I wish I had cut off with the scribe, but alas, that's okay. So here we are, second to last cookie in this set. I'm calling this the Monochrome stripes. Super simple. I wanted to do 2 simple designs in this set to balance it out. I was doing a lot of really complicated, time-consuming designs, and I knew for my sanity, but also for, I think it's important for visual contrast to have simpler designs as well. So those more complicated designs, I did just 2 cookies each, and these 2 simpler ones, these last 2 that I'll show you, I did much more than 2. I want to say maybe 8, maybe 10. So I did this cookie in this design in all of the colors of the ombre. And simple start doing a 1 consistency outline and flood. Since my flood was on the thicker side, I could do 1 consistency. But needed my little jiggle from the scribe. Oh, I just love this color so much. Beautifully smooth. And I allow that to crust, and just doing simple lines. Soft peak. Piping in the direction of my happy place. left to right, and that's it. Simple, but ties in the lines, the cross lines that I'm using a lot in this set. Shaving off the little bit at the end, and there we have the monochrome stripes. And the last cookie in this set is the Mon cœur. Now, if you do speak French, you will see that I did not connect the O and the E. I know. I'm really disappointed in myself too. I just got confused. I was doing it in cursive and I just was not thinking straight. But mon cœur in French directly translates to my heart, but it's also a term of endearment for my love, my sweetheart. Obviously these are hearts, so I liked kind of the multiple meanings and the literal meaning of my heart. And I just like the idea of piping a word in not English. You know, a lot of people will do this kind of design with the word love, and I've done that before, but I wanted to do something different. Same thing here. I'm doing a 1 consistency outline and flood, but it's taking me longer than the other cookie because this is the bigger size. I remember I did 2 sizes of hearts. This is the bigger one. The other one was the smaller one. I will allow this to crust before I move on to piping the lettering. Some tidbits about the lettering that I'm about to do. This, I used a font. I used font Monthglade, I believe it's called. I will link that in the description of the video. And I just downloaded this font and put it on my computer and then typed out the words. So I did my own connecting here of the beginning and the end. This is a pretty common kind of design for words to do, where you start from one side of the cookie and end on the other. I just love just how kind of elegant this font is, and it's not super, it's legible enough, but not super legible. So it's a little more artistic, I guess, is what I'm saying. So you see there I should have connected the O and the E. Oopsie daisy. Oh. But c'est la vie. It's still pretty. And there it is, mon cœur. And there we have it. That is the last cookie in the set. Friends, 17 cookies later, and we have finished the set. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope you try these yourself. 1 design, 2 designs, all 17. Good luck. Have fun, most important. Bye.